Is ice your new best friend? Thanks for checking out this training video brought to you by Runner's Den. I'm Ron French. Anytime you experience an acute injury, the most important thing you want to do is to get ice on it as soon as possible. When an area is injured, you're going to experience swelling, and that swelling really slows down the healing process. Get some ice on it. That's going to slow down the rate of inflammation, thus speeding up the healing of that injury, and certainly we all want to get better faster. Be sure to elevate the injured area as well to help reduce the swelling. Remember this acronym, RICE, Rest, Ice, Compression, Elevation. Again, Rest, Ice, Compression, Elevation. Those four things, again, will greatly reduce the amount of inflammation that rushes to that injured area, thus speeding up the healing. When you are actually icing the injury, try to keep it to about 10 minutes per session. That's going to keep you safe from any kind of ice burn or maybe frostbite to the area due to the exposure of the ice. So about 10 minutes at a time. We do recommend, of course, repeated icing sessions, but you want to give it a break. Make sure that the injured area that you're icing returns to normal body temperature. So again, warm to touch, and the nerve sensation, make sure it's back to normal as well before you go into another 10-minute icing session. So warm to touch, normal nerve sensation to that area. The easiest way to ice at home, keep a few paper cups of frozen water in the freezer. Bring those out when you need to. Ice the area, kind of massage the area with those ice cups. Moving around in a circular motion. Never just apply it. It's too cold, on the skin. So make sure you're moving it around to do a better job of icing that injured area. This is the most messy way to do it, the most effective, but it is certainly messy. So make sure you have a towel handy to dry up, the mess of the melting ice. If icing with ice isn't possible, you can always get one of the reusable ice bags that we sell right here at Runner's Den. We do have them here in inventory. You can also use frozen veggies like peas or corn, something small like that, that will help form around that injured area to give you a nice ice pack type feel. So do that. Short and sweet, the information today. Just remember, though, again, that ice is your best friend, and remember RICE, Rest, Ice, Compression, Elevation for a speedy recovery. Thanks for watching. More informational videos coming your way very, very soon. And always remember, your running specialty headquarters is Runner's Den since 1978.